Well, hello folks, and welcome back to Skybound to the Ground with Michael Lombart. My name is Michael Lombart. Last time we learned about that magical force called lift, which holds airplanes up in the air. We learned how lift is produced by air flowing over the wings, and we also learned how we can produce more lift by changing the angle at which the wing flies through the air. Well, when we left off, I mentioned that there is a dark side to lift, and that's exactly what we're going to be dealing with in today's lesson. And just for the info, today's lesson is based on the Pilot's Handbook of Aeronautical Knowledge, Chapter 4, entitled Aerodynamics. And because it's such a large chapter, we're not going to do the whole thing in this lesson. We're going to break it up into some bite-sized, digestible chunks. Alright, that sounds good, doesn't it? Why don't we go ahead and dive right into it, the dark side of lift. First of all, to set the scene, I need to introduce you to 4 associates. Now, these 4 associates can't exactly be called friends because they're always in opposition to each other. But nonetheless, these 4 associates are 4 forces. Now, we learned about the first force in last lesson, that force that holds airplanes up in the air. And what do we call that force? Let's draw the little arrow to represent that. We call that force lift. Okay. And lift is produced because we got air flowing over the wings. How do we get the airplane to move through the air so that we can get the air flowing over the wings to produce lift? Well, we have to have this thing up front. In this case, we got a prop, and that's going to move our airplane forward. The prop produces thrust, and so that is our forward force. And the forward force is called thrust. Okay, what is lift supporting? Well, the airplane, if you could put it on a set of scales, you would see that it weighs a substantial amount. And that is what the lift is overcoming, the weight of the airplane. And so the downward acting force is weight. And there is one more force that we got to see, and it acts rearward, and it tends to slow us down. You might have said to somebody who was trying to slow you down, "Don't be such a drag." Yeah, that is the rearward acting force. So here is our backwards arrow, and drag is the force that tries to slow the airplane down. Okay, so these are the 4 forces. Lift works against weight, thrust works against drag. Now here's a question for you. Let us take our airplane up to, say, 5,000 feet, cruising along at 100 knots. We're holding our altitude just perfectly, and we're not speeding up or slowing down. We are in steady, straight, and level, unaccelerated flight. What do you think the relationship is between thrust and drag, lift and weight? Well, let me tell you right now, they are equal. Thrust is equal to drag, lift is equal to weight. Now, you might be saying, okay, hold the phone here. I would beg to differ. Thrust needs to be greater than drag because the airplane is going forward at 100 knots. Okay, well, let us explore this situation here. And to do that, we're going to put our airplane on a very slippery frozen lake. And the airplane is just sitting there. The engine's not running at all. It's just sitting there still. But we're going to come up behind it, and we're going to give it a nice big shove, and we're going to push that airplane. And what's going to happen? The airplane's going to start sliding across the lake, right? And notice the engine isn't running. But the airplane, how far is that airplane going to go? Let's say that there's no friction on the surface of the ice. That airplane is going to keep going right up into the end of the lake until you get to the tree at the other side of the lake and smashes into it or something. And there's nothing that keeps the airplane going aside from its momentum. We don't have the engine on. All we had to do is give it a good push. And that's because of our friend Isaac Newton, and he told us that that once an object that is at rest is going to stay at rest unless some outside force acts upon it. Likewise, an object that is moving is going to stay moving unless, again, you have some sort of outside force that changes its direction of movement or just plain stops it. So that's exactly what's going on with the airplane. Now, remember, when you're going down, say you're going down the freeway at 100 miles per hour, and you stick your head out the sunroof, you feel all that wind resistance, and it might kind of want to drag you back. That's exactly what's happening to the airplane in flight. And so, even though you don't, once you get moving, you don't necessarily need thrust to keep you moving, unless there is some force that is working against you. So you have the drag that is of the wind resistance that is trying to slow you down. And so in that case, you do have to have your motor running, and that'll produce just enough thrust to equal the amount of drag that the airplane is experiencing. And in that case, the plane will stay going at the exact speed that it was flying at. So that is why thrust and drag are equal. What happens if you increase your throttle a bit, maybe 1,000 RPM more? Well, the airplane will start accelerating, but then drag is going to catch up to you. And this is, it's kind of like the inevitability. There's two things in life that are always certain: death and taxes. Well, it's kind of like this: weight and drag. You're always going to have these things trying to slow you down and pull you down. And the faster you go in an airplane, the more drag you're going to experience. It's actually kind of like if you tried to run through water. The faster you try to run, the more it tries to slow you down, right? And if you look at a little chart of this, drag actually increases as the square of airspeed. So let's put airspeed on the bottom here. This is how fast your airplane is traveling through the air. And then drag, I'm terrible at writing sideways, so let me just turn this here. That is drag. So we're just going to plot this really simply. As you start going faster, drag increases with the square of the airspeed. So if you double your airspeed, drag quadruples. Woo! Yeah. And we have a name for this type of drag. It's called parasite drag. And you can kind of imagine it as a leech that, like, say you try to go through that lake and you start running through the lake, and you have all these leeches that attach onto you. And they really would slow you down, because, yeah, sorry for that disgusting picture. But anyway, so parasite drag. Thrust and drag are equal when you are in unaccelerated flight. If you're maintaining 100 knots, thrust and drag are going to be equal. If you're maintaining 60 knots, thrust and drag are going to be equal. And so, what about lift and weight? You can probably guess where I'm going with this, that yes, lift is going to be equal to weight. And it's actually not quite as hard to imagine, because if you look at it, well, say the airplane weighs 3,000 pounds. Okay? So if you're just going to hold the airplane up, 3,000 pounds worth of airplane, how much force are you going to need to hold that airplane up with? 3,000 pounds of force. So the wings, in order to keep the airplane level at 5,000 feet, or 2,000 feet, or 2 feet, all you need to do is produce 3,000 pounds of lift, and that's going to counteract the weight of the airplane. Okay, what if we want to climb? What is going to happen then? Well, let's take a look at that. We're just going to look at our wing here, and so I have a little bit more real estate. I'm going to turn that upwards. Okay, let's take a look at the wing. And we are traveling forward. Here is our wing. And the direction of flight is that way. Remember what the relative wind is? It's that breeze that we feel in our face when we're going down, when we're going forward. And so here's the relative wind blowing at the wing. And the air is going to be flowing over the wing, creating lift, all that lovely stuff. Well, here's that chord line, the imaginary line from the trailing edge to the leading edge of the wing. And we measure the angle at which the wing is meeting the relative wind, relative to that chord line. And we call that the angle of attack. And we learned last lesson that we can increase the amount of lift that the wing is producing by changing that angle of attack, by increasing it. So that's just what we're going to do, because we want to produce more lift to get the airplane going uphill. Alright, so let's do that. We have pitched this wing up Okay, it's still going that direction because we just have pitched it up, and now the angle of attack has increased. So that angle of attack is greater. What happens to lift? Lift has increased now. And so, what we had before, we had 3,000 pounds of lift. Now we have, say, 3,100 pounds of lift. And so the airplane now is going to start going in an upward direction. Cool! Now that the airplane is established in this climb, the relative wind is going to be blowing at it at this angle now because we're going uphill. And so the angle of attack has once again been reduced to roughly its original value. And so the wing is going to be producing 3,000 pounds of lift. Fair enough. Now, if you really were paying attention to what I did in the very last drawing, you'll notice something a little bit interesting. Notice this arrow is pointing that way. That's because lift acts in a direction perpendicular to your direction of flight. But this kind of constitutes a problem because we want lift to be acting upwards, right? Well, let's look at our airplane again. Our airplane is now in this climb. And once again, this is not an art demonstration. Okay, so we are now moving up this way. We have 3,000 pounds of lift being generated by the wing. The airplane still weighs 3,000 pounds. And those 3,000 pounds are still acting directly down towards the earth. But now notice, we still have drag, still have thrust, but now our lift is working a little bit against us. It's working, some of it is working in the direction of drag. And that complicates things, because even though you have 3,000 pounds of lift being generated by the wings, and the airplane weighs 3,000 pounds, not all of that lift is actually doing the job that it's supposed to be doing. But hey, look over here. We have thrust. Some of it is pointing upwards now. And so the thrust is helping contribute to the lift. But thrust is having to do two jobs now, because it has to pull the airplane through the air as well as help support the airplane in terms of the lift. And so what do? The airplane is either going to slow down, or if we want to keep maintaining our speed, we're going to have to increase that thrust somehow. And it's the same thing as if you're driving down the freeway. Once again, you're going at 60 miles per hour and you get a steep hill ahead. What do you do if you want to keep going at 60 miles per hour uphill? You have to step on the gas pedal. Okay, so the airplane, now we've increased our thrust, and okay, let's just illustrate that there. So we have more thrust going on, and the airplane is in, once again, unaccelerated, steady state flight. It's moving forward, it's moving upwards, but it's not changing the rate at which it's moving forward or changing the rate at which it's moving upwards. And so, instead of saying that lift is equal to weight, thrust is equal to drag, because now it's kind of been complicated by the fact that things are bending all over the place, we're just going to say that the forward forces are equal to the rearward forces, and the upward forces are equal to the downward forces. And our airplane is in steady state unaccelerated flight. Okay, hopefully that made sense to you. Now we can move on to the dark side of lift. After I clear my throat here. Okay, let us take a look here. And I need to take a look at my notes, which are buried along here. So, oh yes, here we are. Now remember, in our last lesson, when we learned about how lift is produced, we learned something interesting about the wing. The shape of the wing helps make the air that's flowing over the wing accelerate relative to the air that's flowing under the wing, and that in turn produces a low pressure area compared to relatively high pressure underneath the wing, and that helps produce lift. Now this is important because if we look at the wing from a rearward view, here's our wing, looking at it kind of like from an angle like this, you know? Okay, so you have the low pressure, you have the air flowing over like that, flowing underneath, and you have this low pressure area, area on top of the wing and high pressure underneath. Now, what tends to happen is the air underneath wants to come up and equalize itself with the low pressure on top. And so it's going to come up. There's this area over here, the wingtip, there's nothing blocking it, so it comes up and it wants to make its way up into the low pressure area. By the time it gets there, the wing's already gone, and it just leaves behind this swirling wake behind it. And that is called a wingtip vortex. And all airplanes produce this. It's made on both wingtips, right here, and that vortex actually increases in strength as you increase the angle of attack. And all the energy that goes into producing this vortex and the turbulence that is associated with it actually has the effect of bending lift backwards. Once again, not a very good situation, because what happens when lift is bent backwards? It basically works in the direction of drag. And so we actually call this drag, we call this induced drag, because the production of lift induces this drag effect. This is very important, because this is the dark side of lift. When you're flying an airplane at higher and higher angles of attack, lift has this nasty habit of producing all this drag behind the wing. Not a very good thing. It also produces dangers when you're flying behind large aircraft, because the larger the airplane, the larger the wake that it's going to produce, the larger these wingtip vortices. And if you happen to fly a little Cessna behind one of these Boeing heavy airplanes, you could get flipped over if you happen to encounter the wake. And so that's why in later lessons we deal with wake turbulence, airport operations. We'll learn about techniques on how to avoid hitting airplanes' wakes, because you can't exactly see them out there, but they are there nonetheless. So that'll be something interesting to keep in mind for future lessons. But so we realize that angle of attack does have some important considerations to it. If you increase the angle at which the airplane, at which the wing is flying, that angle of attack, you're going to be producing stronger wake turbulence, stronger wingtip vortices, and with those comes more induced drag. Actually, if you look at the chart that we were just drawing, no, we're going to get to that in just a minute. Okay, so you produce more induced drag. There's also another thing that comes along with flying at higher angles of attack. Angle of attack is something you have to be careful with. So, you've got this airplane at a relatively shallow angle of attack. There's the relative wind blowing at it. If you pitch up that wing and get it to a point where it goes past a critical angle, each wing has a critical angle of attack based on the design of the wing. The air that was originally flowing smoothly over the wing, suddenly it can't conform to the surface as it was supposed to the top surface of the wing, and you get this separation going now. And what happens is it eddies and burbles, and it produces all sorts of turbulence on the wing. When you're flying the airplane, you can actually feel this buffeting going on in the controls, and lift is destroyed in this process. And you know what this is called? That's right, this is called a stall. And it has absolutely nothing to do with the state of your power plant up front. It has everything to do with the air that's flowing over the wings. It's an aerodynamic condition. When the wing is no longer producing lift because it's at such a high angle of attack that the airflow has separated, it is in a stalled condition. So angle of attack is something you got to be very careful with, and you always got to be aware at what angle of attack your airplane is flying at. This airplane is flying at a low angle of attack. If you have the airplane still having it's still maintaining its altitude, but it's all pitched up like this is a high angle of attack, and you're producing a lot of drag, and you're very close to a stall. And what happens when you stall? The airplane starts dropping out of the sky. And that's actually exactly what happened with the Asiana flight down at San Francisco International just a while back with that 777 that crashed right short of the runway. They got too slow. They increased their angle of attack too much, and even though they went full power to try to go around, the airplane had exceeded its critical angle of attack and stalled out of the sky. It happens to small airplanes, it happens to large airplanes. So, we got to be careful with the angle of attack, but there is one other way that we can actually increase the amount of lift that our wings are producing without having to increase the angle of attack. You want to find out? Let's take a look here. Alright, we need to look at the lift equation. So let me write it out here. So here is what the equation looks like. And you are probably starting to freak out right now. You say, oh no, it has finally caught up with me. Now we're going into mathematics. Now don't worry about it. I have just as much of an aversion to mathematics as you do. We are just looking at this for an illustration. And I'm going to draw this out in plain English for you. Okay, so that L actually stands for lift. The C over L, that stands for the coefficient of lift, which is actually determined by angle of attack. So we're just going to put angle of attack right there. And then V stands for velocity or airspeed. So let me put airspeed down. And I'm not going to write out the other two because they are not as important. They just stand for density of the air and the wing surface area. It's not really something that we can change directly, but we have direct control over our angle of attack and airspeed. And here is what I wanted to say. It doesn't take a mathematics major to understand that if you use bigger numbers in your multiplication, you're going to get a bigger answer, right? Right, yeah. So if you have bigger angle of attack, you're going to get more lift. Same is true for airspeed. If you have bigger airspeed number, if you have more airspeed, you're going to get more lift. And that's pretty obvious because you'll have more air flowing over the wings. So, let's just look at our airplane right here. We're flying along at, say, 10,000 feet and 100 knots. Well, I'll make that 500 knots because it's a Boeing 767. And so we're flying along, we pull our throttles back all the way to idle. What's going to happen to the airplane? It's going to start slowing down. You won't have as much air flowing over the wings, and so lift will start decreasing. So what do? We haul back on the yoke so that we increase the pitch attitude of the plane, and then we increase the angle of attack, and that will help. That will produce more lift once again, so that the airplane will still be able to maintain its altitude there. Because we pulled the throttles all the way back, the airplane's going to keep on slowing down. You've got, as you increase your angle of attack, you got those wingtip vortices that get bigger and bigger, and they produce more drag, and that slows the plane down even more. And what ends up happening is you get to the point where if you're going to pull back one bit more, you're going to stall the plane because the air won't be able to flow over the wings anymore. And or else, if you don't pull back, the airplane is going to start descending because it just doesn't have enough lift on the wings. So, what do? We fly faster, you produce more lift. You fly slower, and you produce less lift. And you conversely have to use greater of an angle of attack. And you have to be careful with that. And that's why flying takes training. because there are counterintuitive. Sometimes it's counterintuitive. You'll get to the point where the airplane, if you try pulling up, it's not going to go up. It might go the opposite direction, and that's because of that nasty little habit that lift has of producing drag, this induced drag, when you're flying at high angles of attack. So that is, now that we're thoroughly disgusted with drag, this thing that is always there trying to slow us down, I want to tell you about a place where drag doesn't have as much of its tyrannical power. But you probably guessed it, we are now out of time, and so we're going to have to deal with that interesting topic next time on Skybound on the Ground.